We are delighted to have our first keynote for this conference, and we are especially excited to hear Lisa Onaga. So Lisa Onaga is a permanent senior research fellow at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. Her research explores the entanglements between materials, animals, genetics, industry and agriculture through the scope and transformation of silk making in modern Japan. So this research is gonna come into a book that we're waiting for, a book called Cocoon Cultures, the entanglement of biology and silk in modern Japan, that will be published at Duke University Press. More recently, Lisa Onaga started a new research project called Protein in Fibers, which explores animal fibers in an interdisciplinary way at the crossroads of material sciences, humanities, biology, and the arts. So today she will talk about, she will give us a paper entitled "Why We Need a History of Biomaterial in Japan." And so thank you. I will leave you the floor. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Alice, and thank you very much, everyone, for having me here, and Alexandra. I'm excited to be part of this celebration of 50 years at CRJ, CJR, sorry. So I want to start by inviting you to take a look at this image and ask yourself, is this familiar to me? What does it remind you of? What is the form? What is the shape? And does it remind you of something, maybe washi, Japanese paper, the special paper made from the inner barks of Mitsumata, Gampi, or Kozo plants that make it very strong, unlike my voice, which is a little bit in recovery from a bit of a cold. So, but a closer look in the upper right corner shows you maybe it looks a little bit like leather, or maybe a little bit like fur. There's a patina and a certain shine. There's imperfect spots and unevenness. And there's wisps on the edge that trouble our common sense of what this object could be, what it should be. In fact, it is a sheet made of 100% silk. And the silk spun by about 400 larvae of the silk moth Bombyx morai. And this is on the surface of a flat surface, a file cabinet. Silkworms are usually known for producing raw material that we humans use to weave silk textiles. They normally spin their cocoons around themselves if they have a three-dimensional, on the z-axis, something that they can stick their silk onto. And if they don't, they end up creating sheets like this. And so to create these sheets in 2019 at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, where I work, artist-in-residence Vivian Xu experimented with the question of what happens when you take away that scaffolding of the z-axis. And the result was this, as she kept adding and adding and adding, metamorphosing silkworms. Her experiments and research in pursuit of her art sit at the intersection of biology, technology, material fabrication, and design. In this experiment, she approached the silkworm with a view that it was a technology wired to act in a particular way and to behave as one might predict. And yet the object in the end was not something that could be totally predicted. You can see here the side view after the sheet is pulled away, and you can see perhaps layers, small layers after layer of silk sheets. So here Vivian is pulling away the experimental sheet from the surface. And what was it exactly that she was pulling away as she came into contact with that? Is it a silk art, a silkworm art, a silk material, silk art material, etc.? if it was anything to be sure, it was a record of that interspecific experience in 2019. This artist's approach to this animal material, silk, familiar to people in East Asia since ancient times, is indicative of a dynamic longue durée process by which we humans relate to other species. In the humanities, many different kinds of human-animal relationships have been examined, and a scholarly trend has largely focused on whole organisms, companions, pests, draft animals, wildlife, their consumption as taxidermy, in fashion, in food, and in representations, in film, literature, poetry, etc. And these are just a few examples that you may find familiar, and then there are many more that are kinds of animal-human relationships that are missing. But the focus on the whole of the animal has produced a particular kind of gaze upon animal-human relationships that contributes to multi-species understandings of an ecological whole. And that's important. And there are still questions that need to be asked about how humans have processed and used animals to envision alternate histories, alternate futures. This is especially the case considering futures where material of fauna, flora, and fungi are viewed as more and more interchangeable. I want to make a provocation today. Today we are witnessing, if not participating, in a biomaterial renaissance, long in the making. By biomaterial renaissance, I regard this as a cultural movement of envisioning the making of new materials by developing bio-inspired and technological repertoires of replacement. And here is a picture, kind of evocative of Vivian pulling away the sheet of silk. A picture taken by an investor of the company MycoWorks in South Carolina in the United States. And this company is making leather with mycelium, the root part of fungi. And it's not just the experimental work of artists like Vivian Xu, but this is an example in broader society engaging in new ventures that recognize a public interest in natural materials. Specifically, by this biomaterial renaissance, living things are used to replace synthetic things that once replaced other things in the 20th century. So take, for example, petroleum-based plastics like vinyl. Those have been used once to replace animal leather, and now people want to find ways to replace those with other natural materials. The vegan fashion designer Stella McCartney, relation to Paul McCartney, has been working with bolt threads in Emeryville, California, to develop not just an animal-friendly, but ecologically friendly handbags. And the bag on the left is an example from fashion house Fumikoda in Nakameguro. And that was partnered with the startup company Mysol in Nagano Prefecture, which is Japan's largest mushroom producer. And those two together are intent on closing the gap in what is projected to be the mass production demand for mushroom leather. What is that? Here's a closer look at the mycelium leather produced at Mysol in Nagano. It's not just food, but also good for textiles and building materials. And that's what the CEO Inui Keita is saying, as he extends his argument made by Bolt Threads and MycoWorks that makes him to make his company, Mysol, the main producer of kinshi, mushroom filaments for leather. The corporate mythology that is perpetuated by Japanese mycelial startup ventures frequently cite foreign competition as a justification for funding investment. These hints in the present give us a useful resource for thinking about the past, not as a teleological exercise, but as a reference point for thinking about what more there is to the narrative than economic competition. I'm reminded here of accounts in the history of material science discipline in the United States, as traced by philosopher of science and scholar of materials I admire very much, Bernadette Bensaud-Vincent, and historians of science Cyrus Modi and Joseph Martin, following the American and European narrators in what is mostly an institutional account, often places the Japanese in a role as the competitor or as lagging, trying to catch up. This contemporary biomaterial renaissance seems to hint at a different way to narrate the past. It is itself a consequence of fundamental questions that humans have engaged with about materials over the longue durée. How different materials have been made, scaled up or down for production, used, degraded, or unmade. It's about making the animal disappear or appear through making new materials that alter the location of animality. This long-term view of biomaterials seems to be a human-animal relation in which that very connection to the whole animal is apparent, yet not apparent. It's phase shifting. So to make greater historical sense of what seems to be a present-day matter of responding to ethical concerns linked to animal rights or environmental sustainability, I'll be referencing the material of silk throughout the rest of this talk, represented in pictures like this, which do not represent your typical silk, but in the bottom here, a lithium bromide solution of silk. And that's with a view to understand how silk inhabits the category of a biomaterial. So this is my overview of what we'll talk about for today. So, yes, un moment s'il vous plaît. So I'll next be talking about the human and animal relationship via the Proteins and Fibers program that Alice mentioned in the introduction. A reverse view of silk making to get at the distinction between what is a bioresource, which is something that we have to work through to understand what is a biomaterial, and what are the different things that fit into what I call and think with a biomaterial river. And these include, we'll go through some disciplinary and international institutionalization processes, or at least glimmers, highlights that I've noticed, and then introduce what emerges in Japan as a practice-based definition of seitai zairyo. And I'll end with a bottleneck case called silk leather that shows why this particular kind of biomaterial or questionable biomaterial is relevant for understanding this particular history. So by looking at human-animal relationships through attention to micro or molecular scale studies of animals in history, we focus on the fact that sometimes we have to think about animal bodies or remains with their proxies. And these proxies can be molecular markers, they can be other residues, or they can be animals processed in various kinds of ways. And this lends itself to a kind of indirect human-animal interaction that can be historicized. And I think that word indirect is really important because it helps us get out of the frame of the conventional ways in which we talk about the whole animal. And so this is what we study in the Proteins and Fibers Working Group at the Max Planck Institute. And we started this out with a question about making animal materials in time, which dealt not only with time as in historical time, but time as in the actual moment of when you introduce a change in the process of rendering, that moment of technique, what does that do to the animal material, and how does that open up a range of different possibilities, which I call material affordances. And this resulted this summer in an edited volume with Laurence Duny on making animal materials in time. And I've circled here two examples that have to do with Japan, in fact, about making pearls in Agobe by Shell Erickson, and making animal glues by Sarah Teasley, who's here with us today as well. So these questions are really important for us to understand the processes that we have to go through in thinking about a history of biomaterials. So, especially in relation, a history of biomaterials in relation to history of human-animal interactions. So these open up questions or retain questions about what is the line between natural and artificial? How much of the original animal remains or plant remains as something changes over time? What is the fungibility between flora, fauna, fungi? What are these basic categories that we've seem to have inherited from people in the ancient period and early modern periods? And so we've been studying this through historical and molecular studies of microbiomic interactions, and this is a collaboration with historians of biology and archaeogeneticists and anthropologists, and most recently with postdoctoral fellow Isabella Dornelas. We've been looking at this concept of reading animal materials, especially in fields like archaeology, material science conservation, and material science engineering, where different kinds of assays, scientific assays involving imaging or even a tacit knowledge of particular professional techniques and so on, are being put into a historical frame. And that is important for leading up to a next stage of this project on historicizing the fabrication of biomaterials. And out of that is a conversation that we're developing and noticing about safety or effectiveness as the affect that's tied between that material that's created or rendered to the location of animality. Again, that original animal, where does it go? And how does safety, our feeling of this is daijobu or anzen, relate to that? So when we think of biomaterials, we need to think not only about the properties of plants and animal fibers, but also the bodies of these organisms in related to fabricating new things. So when we situate, in order to situate this history of biomaterials in our group, fiber is an extremely important concept to work through. It's an elastic concept, and it allows us to open up different kinds of queries about what is the distinction between plants and animals? How does that distinction get changed? How does it get confused? How does it matter, or why does it matter to different kinds of practitioners at different moments in different kinds of practices as well? And how have fibers given rise to new materials in addition? And again, how, when I think of animals personally, I think about the philosophers of biology, Jean Dupré and Maureen O'Malley, and think about organisms as sets of processes. So how are sets of processes, if we think of it that way, not necessarily in a biologically deterministic way, but when we think about processes, how does that open up a vista for thinking and about making new things, and how does that really matter? So before I go to the case study about the biomaterial, is it or is it not, of silk leather, I want to go through the process of silk making with you. And forgive me for some of you who already have intimate knowledge of this, but I'm going to do it in a way that is a bit perhaps unconventional because I'll go backwards. So this is silk. This is what silk skeins look like before they go into a textile factory. But this is what it looks like when you unpack a box of silk skeins and say you're an importer. Okay, and then this is what it looks like, the same silk as it's drying in a re-reeling process in a Japanese workshop. And so this silk is actually gathered up in a wet process where cocoons are boiled in basins and multiple filaments from multiple cocoons are pressed together with a machine, and then you can see the fine threads reeling over the women workers here. These cocoons previously are dried in ovens and collected from around the countryside. This is just a picture from the 1920s in Tomioka. silk mill, and then those cocoons are spun by this animal, this silkworm, also called kaiko in Japanese, and they eat mulberry leaves pretty much for 25 to 30 days non-stop until they start to cocoon around themselves. So here's on the left, the silk cocoon, and reversing the process more, it is inside of it is the pupa that is metamorphosing into the adult. Adults need to mate and then lay fertile eggs, and you can see the little tiny what are called gisang, or the ants, because they're really the size of tiny ants. The caterpillars are hatching, and then the whole process begins. That's in the convention of sericulture. So for biomaterials, how does it differ? Cocoons used to reverse engineer silk proteins require a chemical process of being broken down, a chemical and physical process of being broken down that I'm not going to go into, except to say that these have been important for doing things like 3D printing and so forth. And it just takes a different kind of trajectory. But one of the things that this example, just to start, helps us do is it makes us think about what these bioresources are versus what biomaterials are. And if we start with the silkworms, we know that they, by working with them, they give rise to biological questions and a production of diversity that is managed at an interinstitutional level. And this is manifest in something called the National Bioresource Project. Working with silk gives rise to technological questions. And those are questions about silk cocoons and fibers, which are accessed through physical manipulation. And then in between those two are foods and drugs, which are more like resources, at least in the terms that I'm tracing. And there are various questions here about whether or not food and drugs that we ingest or give to other animals to ingest are actually bioresources. They seem to be, on one hand, or are they biomaterials? And so this fuzzy gray space in the middle is interesting to think with, and I'm going to touch a little bit upon some of those examples. So each of these three stages is, in a way, for me, a historical progression that I'm following. It doesn't mean that they're actually, they can be, some developments might precede others, but just for the sake of organizing thoughts, this is something that I want to do on the way to getting to today's task of figuring out what is a biomaterial, how do our historical actors think about it, going through the silk leather bottleneck example. So I want to do that first by distinguishing how do historical actors think about the word bioresource. And many of us have probably heard about the word bioresource, but we don't use it to talk about it. We don't say, have you taken care of your bioresources today? You actually might say, have you taken care of your laboratory animals today? Or have you taken care of your mice, your guinea pigs, your rabbits, your fish, your monkeys, etc., for your laboratory experiments? Bioresources might also refer to fodder, the grains and legumes fed to other animals, or raw materials like timber used for building houses and so on. Or you might recognize them as economically valuable living things that produce even more value once their flesh, milk, hides, and bones are extracted. Or perhaps the term may remind you of a collection, like a germplasm seed bank, like insurance against a disaster, or bacteria and fungi that are useful for degrading pollutants and biological waste from living things. So bioresource obviously is an English context word, and in that sense it's an actor's category that's mostly maintained salience in the late 20th century, again in the English context. So I'm going to give you a few examples of those. In the journal Science, the term bioresources comes up recently and as early as 1970. in the context of viewing shallow water environments as rich with resources, harvestable materials that require both conservation and development. And the use here by US Geological Survey scientists was to assign economic value to algae, and then they redefined it as a material under threat and valuable because it was measurable and detectable. So again, like it was described as in a kind of an oblique way that there are environmental threats to bioresources. So there are some more high points in the formalization of the development of this discourse in the Anglophone context, as screening and discovery of useful materials arose in biodiversity, such as use of insects for antibiotics. And this 1992 roundtable in bioscience says, in fact, the exploration for and the discovery of new bioresources should become a challenging biological discipline in its own right. So we see here insect scientists trying to create a discipline surrounded in this hinging of capital and conservation. So by 1997 in the global south, especially in India, there is a response to neo-colonial efforts to patent turmeric or neem. Bioresources are then used to make a more evident stand against bioprospecting or intellectual property theft taking place in this backdrop of protecting globally recognized yet national biodiversity. So here, M.S. Swaminathan is the expert who's pushing this agenda for India to protect its bioresources in order to prevent their exploitation of the local people. So one trajectory in which bioresources has been flagged has been in this initial neo-colonial pharmaceutical interest. And it's really curious that in this process, the neologism bioresources has been taken up by actors to empower the global south. So in a way, they're kind of flipping the script. And meanwhile, there's another development at the intersection of agricultural engineering and chemical and material science engineering that begins to regard bioresources as natural renewable sources like organic wastes, and naturally formed or formable raw materials from human and animal activities for forestry, agriculture, aquaculture, etc., to enable the production of food, sustainable products, or even energy. And these engineering perspectives see bioresources as materials like bioplastics, alternatives to the petrochemical industry. So just to understand the broadest institutional contours of this development, what you see here is a result of a small survey I did of journals with the term bioresources in the title. And these come from the Journal Citation Reports database. And what you see is that these are mostly in the global north. It's just a small handful of them, all from the 2000s, except for the Journal of Pharmacy and Bioresources in Nigeria. So seibutsu shigen. The notion of bioresources takes on an institutionalized character in various ways. But if there's anything I want to stress is that there is no one definition of bioresource and not one claim to its history. Still, these highlights may nonetheless give too much credit to the process of how an English language neologism dominates how other objects are discussed. And these really require more attention from scholars, at least to see if this is a phrase and a concept that travels or if there are other salient terms. But for just this exercise, I want to walk you through a brief exploration of what this term bioresources or its near equivalent seibutsu shigen looks like in Japan. In Japanese journals, this term appears as interchangeably seibutsu shigen or shigen seibutsu since the 1970s, and the phrase becomes more regularly used when in 1983, the National Institute of Agrobiological Sciences was established in Tsukuba, Ibaraki Prefecture. Journals started to use the English word bioresource themselves in the journal titles in the 1980s. And the College of Bioresource Sciences at Nihon University specifically established a journal in 1998, published by its Natural History Museum, entitled Journal of Bioresource Sciences. The first couple of issues reported the impact of global warming on marine organisms to the effects of low electric fields on the desiccation of pork products and the impact of steroids on the sex of fish. So it's really all over the place. As one might imagine, the launch of a journal reflects the existence of an ongoing intellectual development that has matured into an institutionally supported discourse. The case of the journal Bioresource Sciences is interesting because it reflects the institutional building behind Nihon University, or Nichidai, established in 1889. In 1943, it established a College of Bioresource Science in Kanazawa. In 1974, a committee was appointed to consolidate all of the model organisms on its campus and bring it together in a specific specimen management facility. And that facility included a reference room, then it became a bioresources science museum, and that included vertebrates, livestock pathology specimens and model specimens that were owned by the Faculty of Agriculture and the former Tokyo Veterinary and Animal Science College, in addition to the large animal skeletons located all around the campus. So here I find it very interesting that in the case of Nichidai, there's a recognizable interest in animal bodies, reflecting the legacy of the veterinary college. But in 2019, this was renamed as the Museum of Bones and Skeletons. So globally, the term bioresource and its decommissioning flags different scientific and political issues. So looking even further into how else the term bioresources has been used or not used to designate life produces a way to understand even better how the value and significance of living things change as new uses for them develop or as the sciences themselves change. So there's 5 different points for historical and social actors that seem to connect these diverse bioresources together as we read across a minimum of 2 languages. So the organisms are easily recognized, they have mostly economic value, they require protection from environmental threats. It's important to have ways to detect or to measure them, and they reflect both scientific and political concerns. So organizing living things into resources is also something that we need to understand as a way to grasp how issues of their ownership and use are related. In Japan, one of the most high-level manifestations of the bioresource concept has been the National Bioresource Project, established in 2002 by the National Institute of Agrobiological Sciences. And this is something I talk about a little bit in the conclusion of my book. This is a nationwide consortium of Japanese laboratories that maintain biobanks of organisms, tissues, and cells for research. And they assist with materials transfer to laboratories and within and beyond Japan. And in this diagram of the 29 resources, you see like the usual culprits, right? Like mouse, Drosophila, C. elegans. There's also macaque and chrysanthemum and soybean, morning glory, and silkworm is on the top row of animals. So some of these are really familiar for laboratory sciences and are explored by scholars like Karen Rader, Sabina Leonelli, and of course Robert Kohler, and Jenny Bangham, who's been looking at Drosophila. But others are really particular to Japan. I want to stress that every organism has its own history in the Japanese context that's worth researching, even if it's one of these cosmopolitan organisms. And even if an animal or plant or microbe seems to already to have been written about in a more all-encompassing work, such as the scholarship by Bruno Strasser, that's not a reason to discount it further from different historical attention, especially from Japan historians. So again, there's multiple people and multiple animals, multiple plants, microbes, etc., and worlds out there to be studied. I don't want to belabor, though, the point of model organisms here, but having a silkworm gene bank on a university campus can be very handy. And in the Kyushu University, this is especially the point where there is the largest biobank here that's part of the National Bioresource Project. And I've had the privilege of working with this laboratory for several years. And last year I took a visit there, and they had just moved to this new campus, Ito campus, and they're right next door to this huge insect genomics biology lab led by Professor Kusakabe. And you can see on the sign here that they are mushi no shiiku hajimemashita. So they've started to rear the insects there, and I interviewed the professor, and I think maybe I had a cup of tea, and then I had a small teaspoon of ground silkworm pupa to try. And they're really interested in finding ways to introduce there are various kinds of insects for food consumption by humans, medical use purposes, and so on and so forth. And that same professor is co-founder of a startup company down the street called Kaiko Limited, and it has an academic value to social value mission. And the company was incorporated in 2018 to develop proteins, cytokines, and enzymes for medical diagnostic agents and reagents using the silkworm body. And their webpage description reads, Kaiko creates hard-to-express proteins by using specially bred silkworms. So they draw on that gene bank at the university to identify silkworm strains that are compatible with their patented baculoviruses, which are special viruses that only infect moths, and they are used to inoculate the silkworms and then react to that, and then they create these target proteins in their bodies, which are then collected. And most of these are used for making veterinary drugs, although during COVID there was some interest at one point to make something for humans. But what they have done is make this mail-in COVID-19 antibody measurement service in October 2020, and this is just for that region of Kyushu. So ground silkworm pupa and reagents for medicines made with silk moth caterpillars help us see how contemporary actors in the system have approached bioresources while also seeming to be resources for health. So again, that's that gray zone in the middle between bioresource and biomaterial. At the same time as components of new drugs and foods, they have to go through quality and safety checks, and for medicine, clinical trials as part of their manufacture. Which brings me to talk about biomaterials. So as we continue this journey and we work our way through and collect different cases together, I see these different cases as leading to a collection. They're pooling up in a body of water. Some of these objects are like dental implants, prosthetics, replacement corneas, microvessels that are used in medicine. So these are all different things. But what are these things made of? What are the materials? And that's my question with silks. So where's the silk science in the production of these things that are going into the biomaterial river? And here's a picture, just an example of an aortic implant prototype that's woven with a combination of polyester, polyurethane, and natural surgical silk. So looking back at this emergence, we go to 1960s, and the emergence of biomaterials is a field. And there's a growing need for discussion about materials research in biomedicine, especially in light of biomedical engineering. And there's various topics that come up, like what's the research between clinical and basic, what's the effect of materials or implants on the coagulation of blood or on your tissues, what are standards for packaging or for prosthetics, what do you do with reprocessed animal bones and tissues? So this led to a conference in 1966 at the New York Academy of Sciences, Materials in Biomedical Research. And here's one of the editorial of the first journal issue of the Journal of Biomedical Materials Research. And you can see here how important this word prosthetics is and implants is, and this is where the focus of concern was. And since then, there were various new societies that developed and also various new journals that developed. And I'm not going to go through this list, but you can take and see how there's quite a bit of activity of making new spaces for people to congregate. And that was also true for Japan. So there's an emergence of biomaterials in this biomedical research, and there's a lot of institutional development. And by 1988, Japan hosts the 3rd International Congress for the World Biomaterials. And the Japanese had 900 delegates attend, and this was viewed for them as the scientific Olympics. And they really got a chance to develop institutionally and show off to their colleagues and become leaders in the field. So there are also different definitions of biomaterials that come up in these decades. Brooke and Hastings, in the first issue of the journal Biomaterials, say that biomaterial may be implanted in the body without causing adverse effects on blood or other tissues. Intentionality and permissibility are thus critical analytics for understanding the processes, as Jan Galinsky described in his book, Making Natural Knowledge. And at UC Santa Barbara, Safinia and Adadi have said that biomolecular materials, now we're talking about biomolecular materials, result from research at the interface between materials science, engineering, and biology. And they're really pushing for more cooperation between different colleagues within the engineering fields. And that's something that Brooke and Hastings had earlier hoped as well. Towards the 2000s, research showed more interest in genetic engineering analysis and new materials like polyurethane, PTFE, which is Teflon, and silicone. And we see kind of a fuzziness get introduced between bio-inspired and biomaterials. Maybe they're the same, maybe they're different. And in those early years, the demarcation between what was and was not a biomaterial first focused on safety, based in dental sciences and the making of prosthesis. So again, the prosthetic perspective is incredibly important, and one of these voices was Takeda Shoji from Osaka Dental University. And he makes this claim or assertion that no material is 100% safe. And what he means by that is safety is subjective, and biomaterials should be defined by whether or not they have the property of expressing the functions it's supposed to have without producing harmful effects on the biology side. So how well do they do what they are supposed to do? And conversely, something that might have high safety and be very inert might not actually be biocompatible and might not be a very good Seitai Zairyo. So this is a diagram by Takeda in that paper. And he shows that it wasn't enough like mutual interactions, mutual actions that could be produced at the interface of materials in the body. So you can see here that there's the physical, chemical, and biological sort of impacts on the zairyo that can wear down, it can get old, that can have an impact on the whole body. The body can react as well to other physical, chemical, biological aspects and then have an effect again on the implant. So he explains that the deterioration has a mutuality with the body, and then safety is defined within whatever is acceptable in that case-by-case situation. As we reach the case of silk leather, I want to keep in mind that there are two kinds of silk, which I didn't mention before. What do you mean there's two kinds of silk? Well, this is how I think about it. There's silk used in the way silkworm caterpillars use it, around their body, right? Or silk in the way that surgeons use it, which is through the body. So silk science engineering for outside body uses are relevant for a history of biomaterials that go in the body as well. So I think that fuzziness, exploring that interface, that interstitial space is really interesting. And because the discourse of silk in surgery often concerns biocompatibility, I mentioned postdoc Isabella Dornelas. She is a colleague of mine, and she's been working on catgut from cattle used in silk in surgery. And so we're comparing silk and cattle as surgical tools. So this is a cross section of silk filament, and these silk filaments consist of two different proteins. There's the inner fibroin, the strong part, and then the stickier outside protein sericin. So there's two fibroins that are extruded by the spinnerets of the insect and that are fused together with this sticky sericin. And historical actors in material science often center on the fibroin, the middle part, and that's often made synonymous with the idea of silk fiber. So stripped of their sericin, fibroin's been used as a surgical suture material for hundreds of years. It's resistant to immediate decomposition and absorption, and it has a great tensile strength and structural capacity. And you can see on the picture on the left here that silk filaments are actually made of different smaller components, protein components, and amino acids arranged in what are called fibrils and microfibrils. And one of the earliest pieces of documentation I can find is in 1804 by Hanaoka Seishu that explicitly mentions the use of silk in surgery. So this is something I'm continuing to look for in history materials. And silk is especially strong when it's braided. This is a close-up 1,000 times micrograph of silk that is from my project in Singapore, Biomaterial Matters. And the silk suture emphasizes that it's important as an obligatory passage point for understanding this history. And it emphasizes a human-insect interface at the level of the flesh that fundamentally differs from interspecific care, wearing clothes or ingesting food and drugs. Thinking about silk as a protein that's sewn into the human body suggests that the silk suture is really important as it gets rendered into a biomedical material. So in 1988, excuse me, that was around the time of of Japan hosting the Biomaterials Congress. They had learned that the United States National Institute of Science and Technology gives out loans to private sector to encourage tissue engineering. And this was basically unheard of at the time in the Japanese context. And so that led to a process of reconfiguration of the research. And over time, what was originally the Sericultural Research Institute dissolved, and by 1994, we see a restructured National Institute of Sericultural and Entomological Science. So two institutes were brought together into one in order to assert the relevance of silk research and to strengthen connections with other public institutions and to promote related fields. So they really want to make a separation or a fusion between these filaments, like silk for the filaments, science for the filaments, and science for the insects. They wanted to bring that together. And so in this new institution, they had these departments: breeding and genetics, bioinformatics, functional development, production technology of insects. And this is all part of a growth of different uses of fibroin protein in the 20th century, in the late 20th century. So we see a generation of sutures and adhesives that also involve fibroin more specifically, that are not of the sewing kind, but just the kind of a plastering kind. The development of biomedical devices like non-woven fabrics coated with silk. So some of you may have used non-woven masks to wear instead of woven masks. So those are to be quite effective. And so all of these things started to receive patents in the 1980s and 90s. And there's also biocatalyst membranes, and all of these things have been useful for various kinds of biomedical experiments and so forth. And fibroin has also been used in cosmetics and the beauty industry. And so I think some of this is a little bit more accessible for the everyday public. So this is the bottleneck case that we're at right now. So to make sense of that progression that you saw on the previous slide, silk leather is important to make sense of all that. Tsuboichi Kozo was the head of the Physical Properties Evaluation and Research Office at this new institute I mentioned, the Institute of Sericultural and Entomological Sciences. When he announced and trademarked silk leather, this is a coating material that combined powderized fibroin with polyurethane paint. The Ministry of Agriculture billed it as one of the top 10 breakthroughs in 1995. And this was a 30% solution and was demonstrated by coating ballpoint pens. Perhaps because of the mundane object efficiently, you know, by itself, it's a safe object, it's an everyday object, it's tactile. But then you touch it. I mean, these pens that you got in your gift bags, they have this like rubber grip at the bottom here. And it has that special feeling that makes you, that in this instance had a leathery, dry texture. Oh yeah, sorry, I didn't show you the picture of the pen, but you can see here these were things that were developed as a proof in concept and trademarked. And at least a decade will pass before Tsuboichi would use the term biomaterial in the legalese of patents, but he would also start to make this pulverized silk finer and finer to 15 and 30 microns. And here are examples of Seiko watch bands that he's making. And so the silk sprays that were developed were made to have properties akin to animal hides. And that critically allowed Japanese silk scientists to regard silk as a biomaterial. So the case of silk leather signifies the micro and nanoscale transformation of fibroin protein materialities from sutures, something that you manhandle with your fingers, to new biomaterials, something that you spray with a can with new properties that are realigned with nature. The silk leather pen became an outreach souvenir of the National Institute in the late 1990s. And meanwhile, Tsuboichi became one of its most prolific patent filers and created wound dressing materials that's shown here on the left, and materials containing both silk fibroin and sericin, to manufacturing crystalline, superfine fibroin silk powder with an average powder size of 1 micrometer. So the watch was like 15 to 30, and this is 1 micrometer, to even smaller extractions of proteins at the peptide level in 2004. So it's getting smaller and smaller, and the momentum to make good on silk's biocompatibility with the body, which began with sutures holding tissues together, and the discursive alignment of silk as a biomaterial was catalyzed or went through this not obligatory passage point, but this bottleneck created by Tsuboichi's work. The silk sprays made to have properties akin to mammalian animal hides helped clear this bottleneck and allowed Japanese silk scientists to regard silk increasingly as a biomaterial. The case of silk leather signifies the micro and nanoscale transformation of a fibroin protein materialities from sutures to new biomaterials with new properties realigned with nature. And some of these are the uses, like coating materials, raw ingredients for shampoos that are sold to beauty companies, adhesives, sutures, and then all of this scaling down and biologizing up led to similar extractions at the peptide level. And those are important for things like cell growth promotion, healing promotion, skincare materials, and so on. And powderization really made it possible for this work of making biomaterials, which is going back to the original envisioning of creating a scaffold material for surgery and tissues, for the prosthetics again. There are new novel uses of silk that are continuing to be developed. And in 2007, in Tsukuba City, Japan hosted the first Asian Biomaterials Congress. So this shows you how much has coalesced since then. So with Seitai Zairyo, this working definition by the actors category involved engineered materials based on natural products that are defined by deterioration. The organism in the natural product is highly processed, yet hard to detect, but it's culturally familiar and the transparency is preferred. There are biological and synthetic characteristics that are enabled by microscale manipulation of this fiber, not as something elongated and to be stretched out, but as something made into a powder or protein or liquid. So this is a snapshot then of how these people in time have been talking and dealing with biomaterials. So perhaps we can say that Japan has already been at the heart of the biomaterial renaissance. And I want to just leave with this idea that this biomaterial renaissance poses a resource for us who study historically and socially things in science, technology, environment, and medicine in Japan. Because biomaterials and bioresources are entwined, at least in the case of silk leather. The material affordances of what pulverized silk is good for is not clear until it's done. And that refers back to this issue of material affordances. Silk gaining a medical edge as a biomaterial in the late 20th century involves a history of manufacturing. And still, so that's kind of where there's some overlaps of different familiar histories and this emergent history. In their exchange of flora, fauna, and fungi categories, biomaterials can evoke animal affects in their absence, informing how qualities such as safety or categorical distinctions of natural and artificial are mapped onto them. And humans are reinserting themselves, and have been in this case, back into nature via biomaterials to promote connections, not distinctions, of humans from nature, even when using artificial processes. So thank you very much, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. So I will just start the discussion and then maybe open to the floor if there are other questions. So what struck me in your paper in the structure or the progression of your paper was of course the question of scaling down and scaling up. And what I was wondering about was with this, of course, if you scale down or scale up, the categories start to be pulverized as the silk itself is pulverized. And what struck me in the end is that so those scientists or industrials were looping back to those giant categories of nature or of animals. So I was wondering, as a historian working on this microscopic materials and biomaterials, what is well, if I put it like quite bluntly, is the animal category or the nature category still relevant for you as a historian? So because through your paper we see that everything is quite entangled. So I was wondering, and I was surprised that nature was coming back in the end. So I was, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. That's a wonderful question, and I think that's why I refer to this indirect human-animal relationship, because if we maintain this idea that the relationship is built on a binary, that we will have a very hard time getting out of it in any given moment. And so one of the things that I've been doing with my research, and ever since I got into this research because I was interested in the biology of the silkworm and its heredity. But having worked on the first book, that left me with larger questions about, well, with the end of World War II and the declining interest in silk manufacture in Japan, where does that leave us with all of the silk that still gets produced or what have you? And so that we could have an economic history of that, right? And there are many of them. But it doesn't, what we haven't had so far are histories that explain, well, what have been the other kinds of things that people have been making with silk, either on a small scale, like a village scale, to a more industrial scale. And that is something I think we're only seeing the fruits of that right now. And that's where it becomes very important to think, how important is it for when the Japanese try to market these things, how important is it to show a picture of the silkworm on it? It's important. It's very important to show it, as opposed to not show it and to hide it and say that this is natural, which goes back to what Bernadette Benson had explained earlier in her work about nanotechnology and genetic engineering, which is that it's scientists have learned their lesson in a way about making things seem so black boxed and creating uncertainty. It's better to create less uncertainty. And so so following that line of what nanotechnologists have sought to do is just create a more this can be analyzed in various ways, right? So the alignment of synthetic things or what have you, new chemicals as natural, is a way to appeal to publics as much as is what's going on with silk products, and calling that as something related to nature, the animal, and so on. So that decision of whether or not to retain the animality or not is a subjective one. It's a social one. It's a cultural one that comes up again and again. And so I would urge you, and everyone, next time you go to Narita Airport, take a look at the gift section and see if you can find products made of silk and see how they're marketed. Because I think many of them have the silkworm on it, or the moth, to declare where it's from, and that's important.
Thank you. And following on this, there was also, well, this linked to some extent. There was also this thing in the beginning with the artist, and there was also, because it's also linked to of course, those categories and how they are, how the link are made again and again. And the thing was, with the artist you mentioned at the beginning, there was this huge thing of uncertainty. Like, we don't know what it is. This is, and I was wondering, following up on this silk protein fibers, how those the question of uncertainty was also an important part of the category of biomaterial, or not, or if it was not relevant, or and if it's through history, if also through the changes in the, of course, the industry of silkworms and silkworm productions, how the uncertainty played a role in the transformation of those industry, and how scientists or the public relates to those materials.
Yeah, it's really interesting how persistent this problem of uncertainty is, and uncertainty related to safety. Determining how safe something is a question and a problem that dates back to at least the mid 1800s in Japan. But there's certainly other kinds of scenarios where uncertainty related to rainfall or drought or agriculture, this sort of thing, comes up. And it's it's really interesting how humans are experts at dealing with uncertainty. In ways, we have many ways of accounting for uncertainty. And yet, this is something that comes up again and again and again. And I think of how generative uncertainty actually is. And that is something that I think is not appreciated well enough. Well, a lot of us, for example, in the wake of the nuclear power plant explosion in Fukushima, there's a lot of conversation about reducing uncertainty, being clear, and what are the safety standards, and so on and so forth. And the same can be said for surgical sutures. What is the acceptable level of safety by which something does not get infected, right? So what is the infection rate, and how does that work out? And it's interesting as well how our conceptions of silk as something that is safe has arisen. And is that not because we have had hundreds of centuries, actually centuries of experience since the ancient period with Galen as of having silk as a surgical tool, which isn't to say that people didn't get infected from it, but it's just that there's a longue durée perspective on human habituation to using certain kinds of products or medical tools and devices, right, that help us feel safer, that feel a little bit more assured and confident about using one thing or another thing. So the greater uncertainty then develops when there are replacements. And that's why I'm really interested in this idea of repertoires of replacement, which is not necessarily about totally displacing something from use, but the question of like, how well can we get away with this and still have the same work done? So what is the work that we want to do? Can we replace this with this? Will the effect be the same, better, without the judgment of taking that original thing away?
Well, I'll just ask one more question and then open to maybe to question in the audience. But on this, this replacement idea, I was wondering how, as a historian of science and technology, it's how would you? Because of course, as we have seen in your wonderful talk, the idea is also of like giving some singularity to each biomaterial. And I was wondering if you go to if you work on this comparative and its comparison and the idea that those material can be replaced, how do you work through this, the conjunction of the historical singularity and then the comparative and the replacement, the potentialities for replacement? I don't know if it's clear, but how do you deal with those the two lines of thought?
Yeah, so I hear what you say about the historical singularities, and it's true, and I think that's why I'm really attracted to this idea of the tributaries in one river, and it's just kind of riffing off of Joseph Needham, right? So like, how many kinds of sciences are there? Are they all one flavor? Are they all going into the same river, gushing into the same endpoint of universal science? Yes, no. We know the answer to that. So it's kind of like a conceit to work through this idea that we all ought to be going into the same direction and we all ought to have one way of talking about this on the other hand, there is, interestingly, this matter of language that as I showed by working through bioresource and biomaterial in different languages and in different contexts, they refer to different things, and different historical actors take advantage of that murkiness to lay particular kinds of ontological and epistemic claims. And so what then is really interesting about this issue that you raise is the point of comparison, and that's useful for thinking on a general view. And if we have a general view that in which scientists and technologists are also part of the public, the general public, then how is that preference for replacement expressed? How is that preference for replacement made known, right? Is that really a technocratic move to say, we're going to do mushrooms now? That's a really great idea. It seems like it's coming from the ground up, but it's through examining startup companies like Bolt Threads. Actually, they started out with silkworms and they went through spiders, and then they ended up with mycelium. And so it's through watching them, and I've been watching them from afar for a while, it's really interesting to see how their process of product development is experimental. And in various ways, it's also through different kinds of partnerships. So that's a way to gauge, like, what is the public interested in? How is there a dialogue between consumers who want to see certain kinds of change, who have preferences, and make that known, right? So I read an article, actually, a couple days ago that said that French wine growers are having trouble right now because worldwide trends of wine consumption are changing and fewer people are drinking wine. And so there's a big question of, like, how do you sustain the heritage of French wine production when people aren't drinking it? So what sort of changes are afoot globally that make people conscious of the different kinds of issues, where things are grown, how things are made, how things are produced? And that is part of, I think, the larger question of, like, how do we understand this replacement? How do we understand preferences, or are they made to become choices? How are they presented to people so that people think, oh, I have that idea, you know? The best idea is an idea that you lend to somebody who then decides that that's their own idea, right?
Thank you. We'll still have a few minutes for question. Oh, yes. So I will bring. Do we have another one? No.
I am the flying mic.
Okay, and I can do it. Yes, I can fly. Okay, so you were first. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you so much for your talk. I was wondering, in the field of bioresources, what is the place of ethics? Since you're dealing with a living organism, and so I was thinking about vegans, for example. You were speaking about the célébration, for example. And, well, this is living matter. So is there some kind of ethics or, you know, reflection about it? Thank you.
So thank you very much for the question about how do we situate ethics in something like the bioresource programs, or any university laboratory practices, even for that matter. And it's really interesting. I can speak about the bioresource project, especially with the silkworms. There is this idea that they're like seed banks, that they are important to preserve and maintain as heritage, because they have been created, bred by people, and even if they are not immediately useful, they may serve some purpose in the future. And so that's the driving ethic for preservation. And this is also the same for blood. And if you want to read more about blood and ethics, I recommend a book called Life on Ice by Joanna Radin. that discusses the ethics of dealing with blood samples from humans and how important that is, how the problems that is on a material level for preservation. And this is all something that impacts the silkworms too, because of the expectation of the, so there's this ethic to preserve and to maintain and to ensure futures. At the other hand, that is an incredibly energy-dependent process. And so that has led to alternatives like cryopreservation of gametes, eggs and sperm, and then alternative methods of storing, so not just in refrigerators. And this is a huge problem after 3/11 in Japan, because entire mice stocks were not eradicated, but they drowned because they were of water sprinklers going off and not stopping. This is in Tohoku. So there are various kinds of contingencies that have to be thought about for the preservation matter. Yes, thank you.
Hi, does it work? Hi, Lisa. I'm Ian Miller. I really love the work. This is fabulous, and the project is terrific, and the special issue is too. I wanted to speak to and amplify Alice's query and really your answer, and kind of ask you to elaborate a little bit further. I'm curious how your actors in particular, so I'm taking the fourth of the bullet points up above as your voice, and so that may be incorrect, which might shorten your answer very quickly. But I'm curious how your actors are talking about what it meant to be human in these contexts. As you know, in the Nature of the Beast, I make a similar argument about how nature and culture are always already interpenetrating under modernity, but actors are within the particular setting of the zoological garden, and adjacent institutions and communities mobilize the distinction as a means of shoring up the category of the human to serve particular political and cultural agendas. And so I'm curious if we're seeing a sea change in your work in that mobilization, or a kind of denialism, a refusal to engage with that question, which is also interesting. So I think I really am eager to hear how they're mobilizing this and how you're reading those mobilizations or a lack of engagement, which leads to a second question. You can choose whichever you want to answer. This one's just really big. And it's about interests and power, which is how, in the zoo, the interests and power around the human and animal as opposing and mutually defining and always interpenetrating categories are just transparently, they're literally spectacle. Your stuff is different. And so here, I'm curious whose interests are served by the elevation of the category of biomaterial. And I'm thinking, I want to make money on animals. That's probably whose interest is being served, but I'm really wanting to ask you to explore with us a little bit more the interest politics behind the categories that you so elegantly laid out for us. So 2 really big questions on a great project.
Thank you so much, Ian. And it's great to have this point of comparison with the zoo, and thinking about what's the most iconic and visible way of displaying animals, right? And this, as you call it, the exhibitionary complex. And then here, these scientists are doing their darndest in a way to work with the smallest scale version of these living things. So for the scientists themselves, how do they think about themselves as humans? What is the relationship of themselves with animals and so on? For this, most of these people in the 60s, 70s that I'm looking at, this is not so prominent. Like, the human is so central. And we're talking about people who are dealing with the combinations of effects of various post-wars in the mid-century, and various kinds of environmental harms and so on. And so the human is much more central in that regard. But one of the things I found really interesting was this question of like what to do with like leftover animal tissues and things like this. And so there's a kind of discard studies aspect of what to do with waste, which also is coming up in this. I think it overlaps with this growing interest in the environment and so on, but it's not so prominent, right? Because it's really more about the medical arena and how to improve human life. And animals are still very much a tool. They are a resource for humans. Scaling up of agriculture is happening at that time. The Green Revolution is occurring, and so on. So these questions of animal rights, so on and so forth, is not as prominent in that discourse. They're not really responding to that per se. You'll have to give me a keyword to help me remember the second question. Right. So the word biomaterials, I mean, is something that I think is rooted in the discipline, in the disciplining, not monodisciplines, but multidisciplines. So it's something that is coming out. I think it's one of the our glimmers of the convergence of different forms of engineering that are happening in the mid-century. So this is, if we look at those roots, it starts out within the disciplines, and it's a question of how do we work together, how do we collaborate, and in order to do that, how can a common language help? And I think that's where we see this beginning of biomaterials, and it is true with this turn right now to producing new materials and new things. It does seem to lend itself, this scenario that we're in does seem to lend itself to, well, isn't this related to capitalism? Isn't this part of just another rendition of how the Anthropocene, as you put in your book, has always already been present? And perhaps there's some aspects of it that are. On the other hand, perhaps there are other aspects of thinking with and through biomaterials that are trying to do exactly the opposite, which is to seek solutions and amelioration in the face of harm. I attended a mushroom workshop at TU Berlin, led by Vera Meyer, and it was kind of a hackathon sort of thing, and there were a bunch of scientists in the room and some artists and me. I was the only historian there. And they're brainstorming, what should we do? We have this technology. We are working on mycelium. It was really the first time I had heard of this. And I really didn't understand it, so they gave various presentations on what is mycelium. It's very sturdy, it has these properties, etc. And then they grouped us up and had us think about what these could be for. So did we use the word biomaterial? I really can't remember at that time because this wasn't really where it was right now. But I could see how that kind of conversation gets to develop within a university's sort of collaborative, interdisciplinary, interdepartmental space. So that sort of thing is really important. And indeed, there are various investors involved in universities who want patents, want to scale up. They want the professors to have startup companies, and we see this all over the world as well. But then what about these other people around the world who are also trying to do maybe similar things with non-woven fabrics, and also developing things on their own outside of these structures too? So we have to take that into account, and how do those people start to talk about the work that they do? Thanks.
Thank you. Maybe we'll have one last question.
Hi, thank you so much for a wonderful talk. Can you talk a little bit about how people in science laboratory and industry take care for the silkworm? I'm asking because when I was PhD, I was doing field work in a stem cell laboratory, and I was looking for how scientists care for cells and laboratory animals. Laboratory animals is a bioresources for scientists, but they have to care for each rat and mice. So I was wondering how, even though the silkworm is bioresources, but people in the industry somehow care for them. So how do they care? Or maybe this question is related to the ethics. So yeah.
So how do people in universities care for their silkworms? I think it depends on who's doing the care and what the purpose is for. So rearing the silkworms, so there are various people who are doing experiments, right? So from students to postdocs to full professors and so on. But the question is, like, where do the silkworms come from? And I think that's where the question resides, because of what their endpoints are. Often in an experiment is an end. The life stops because the experiment has to stop, and then the life doesn't cycle through. So the people who maintain the spaces for perpetuating the silkworms, like at Kyushu University, to some degree at Tokyo University, they're charged with maintaining the stocks that cycle year after year after year. And so orders can be requested, could I please have this strain? And then that strain would be sent over in the form of eggs, and then the university might maintain those year after year after year for their private research purposes. And so in those instances, usually they're fed mulberry. Sometimes the mulberry is artificial mulberry, made from like a powder. And so then they're fed. But I've seen various ways in which silkworms are maintained in laboratories, and they're all quite different because of what the endpoints are, what the scientists are trying to do with them. Yeah. So I think that it's a kind of a case-by-case scenario. I don't know if this answers your question, but.
Thank you so much, Lisa.